I started out actually in high school. I was a born-again Christian. I accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior, as we used to say, and I became very committed as an evangelical Christian, and I went off to Moody Bible Institute for college, which is a fundamentalist Bible college. After that, I went to Wheaton College, which is a liberal arts college. It's Billy Graham's alma mater. It's an evangelical school. So I had very solid evangelical Christian commitments. And eventually, I got a seminary degree, and I was a pastor of a Baptist church for a year. But gradually, for a large number of reasons, I started to question some of the assumptions that I had about the faith. For a long time, I thought that the Bible was inspired and inerrant, that there were no mistakes in the Bible. But as I engaged in historical research on the Bible, as I was getting my PhD in New Testament studies at Princeton Theological Seminary, I started finding mistakes in the Bible. And this cut away at my assumptions that the Bible was inerrant. And then I started questioning other parts of my faith. Is Jesus really divine? Is there really a Trinity? It was difficult. I mean, if you're raised in the Christian tradition, this forms the very heart and soul of who you are. And leaving it means leaving friends. It means alienating family. It means losing out on all sorts of social networks that you have and all sorts of beliefs that you've held dear. And so it's very difficult and traumatic emotionally. But my view at the time was that I was in a search for what is true, and I came to believe it simply isn't true that the Bible's without error. And the idea that Jesus is God is an idea that was developed historically over time among Christians. It wasn't something that was original to Christianity. It's a later historical development. So too the doctrine of the Trinity. And these various ideas that I had held on to, I started to realize were historical formulations, and just the existence of God himself. I finally came to realize that for me, it simply didn't make sense anymore. Well, this is an interesting thing that we think when we read the Bible that we're obviously reading the words that Matthew wrote or that Paul wrote. But the reality is we don't have the originals of Matthew or of Paul's letters or of any other book of the New Testament or of the Old Testament. What we have are copies of these books that were made later, in many cases, most cases, many centuries later. So the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and at present we have something like 5,500 manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament, which is a lot for an ancient book. It's far more than any other ancient book. The problem is most of these copies are hundreds and hundreds of years after the originals, and all of them have differences in them. So that the scribes who were copying these manuscripts changed the text that they were copying, sometimes by accident. I mean, sometimes they just made mistakes. They were sleepy or incompetent or whatever. But sometimes it looks like scribes actually thought the text should say something other than it did, and then so they would change the text. Some places it looks like it's a manipulation of the text, where the author wants to change, where the scribe wants to change what the author said. I mean, in many cases it may be that the scribe thought this is what the author really meant, and so he changed it. But sometimes the text gets changed to say just the opposite of what it originally said. And so that can be a little bit troubling.
But praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years by eyewitnesses. The Gospel writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country. Decades later, where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language. Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change.
Somebody who's studied it again and again, back to front, is it fact? Is anything in there historical fact?
Very little, probably. I think one important thing to bear in mind is that ancient writers had a very different understanding of what fact or fiction was from us today. It wasn't written to be a factual account of the past. I don't think that's the way in which these biblical writers understood the past. But as a historian of the Bible, I think there's very little that's factual.
King David?
No.
Moses?
No.
Somebody said Jesus behind me. I don't think they were taking the Lord's name in vain.
No, Jesus, most scholars would agree that he existed, yeah.
I mean, the books that are there, why those books? Why not other books?
Very few of the biblical books were written to be included in a Bible. Yeah. That's quite a late idea, late from my perspective as a historian. Yeah, so they weren't necessarily written to be included in a Bible. These are religious writings. Some of them got into the Bible, some of them didn't, as we know. The choices that were made as to what should be contained in this collection, I mean, it's very hard to say. Some things were obviously more appropriate, the collectors felt, than others.
I want to emphasize this over and over again, particularly to Christian literalists.
Right.
The people who wrote the Gospels that you think are literal did not think what they were writing was literal. Do you think that the people who put together the Bible didn't realize that there are these mistakes in there? They didn't care.
Right.
We're the only ones who care.
One thing we don't often
times, it's that everything in the Gospels, every so-called event, has strong parallels in what nobody else challenges to be myths. And so why should we believe it all happened in this one case? I'm a big comic book fan, and I always like to point out, it's as if somebody said, you know, I am sure that Superman really did exist. Now, Captain Marvel, the Martian Manhunter, the Green Lantern, no, those are fiction. But Superman really existed. Why should we think so? I mean, it's inspiring, and it would be kind of neat if there was a Superman, but there's just no reason to think so in his case more than the others. If there were any leftover data about Jesus' education, about his family relations, what he looked like, but there's nothing. It's all just mythic hero archetype fodder. All the stories also, so that's my biggie. The second one is that almost every story in the Gospels and Acts appears very likely to be a rewrite of an Old Testament story from the Greek translation, the Septuagint, or from the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Bacchae. I've written a long article on this in an encyclopedia of Jewish interpretation of the Bible, and you just wouldn't have that if there was a good stock of historical memory about this person. And on it goes. Stories brim with contradictions of a kind suggesting repeated editing and evidence tampering, changing the story. Which and how many women visited the tomb and what hour? Was it Mary Magdalene alone, or was she with others? Did she or they see the man or angels, or men or angels before or after she or they had called on Peter and the others? Did the woman or women see Jesus at the tomb or not? Did the risen Jesus tell his disciples to go to Galilee or to stay in Jerusalem? And how on earth do the other gospel writers neglect to report what Matthew tells of a shining angel swooping from the skies to roll the stone away, causing an earthquake and making posted guards faint dead away? And if, per 1 Corinthians 15, 500 saw him at once, why does not one gospel say so? Well, the gospel accounts contradict.
Okay, now one of the most startling discoveries you made from this translation is that the plans for the ark showed that it was to be built round. It was to be round. This is such a departure from the classic stories that we've grown up with.
Well, it's a funny thing, because anyone who's read their Bible knows that Noah's Ark was a kind of oblong-shaped craft. And anybody who ever grew up in any kind of normal house knows what Noah's Ark really looks like, which is a boat with a high front and a high stern with a little house in the middle. Everybody knows both of those images.
Yes.
And I don't think anybody had ever had the idea that the Ark, in its original form, so to speak, might have been a round vessel. So when I first read this, I was astonished. It's a gigantic thing, but the point is that this is mythology we're talking about. It's not a blueprint for reality. It's a mythological story where one of the poets went to a lot of trouble to create a realistic idea of a gigantic boat. So what I think is that in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, which is the homeland of this story, there certainly were very destructive floods, and probably maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago there was once a kind of tsunami which swept across the whole landscape and took all the towns and villages away down to the Persian Gulf. And I think that for the survivors, the memory of this great deluge, which really happened, never disappeared from their minds, and it was passed on for generations and generations. And it's that in the background which then led, I think, to the mythological story of how the animals were saved in a boat. Exactly.
Now, obviously, we know the term...
Yes, please. This is a more personal question than a scholarly question. You have 30 seconds. Jesus shows up in front of you. Who do you say he is? Left to right.
Okay, as a historian, I would say he is a peasant with an attitude. As a Christian, I think his attitude is the attitude of God. Is that 30 seconds?
It was 10. I think Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who anticipated that God was soon going to intervene in history and overthrow the forces of evil and bring in a good kingdom here on earth within his generation.
Yes. What he said, and along with that, I think he was a halakhically observant Jew who followed the Torah of Moses and attempted to teach his fellow Jews what the heart of Torah was. And I think on most of that, his fellow Jews probably would have agreed, and like most Christians today, probably would have said, but you know what, we're not going to do it because it's too demanding to give up what we have, our families, our status, our economics, for the sake of the greater good.
You didn't expect to hear me say this evening, but I agree with what Don and Bart just said. But I just go a little bit further than Bart, that I believe Jesus, believing all that Bart said Jesus thought was going to happen, I believe that Jesus believed that he was embodying God doing exactly that.